You're watching Donald Trump lose a trade war he started. Right now, this minute, as you read this, the most powerful man in the world just got outmaneuvered by a country 1/10 his size, and the fallout is going to hit your wallet harder than any tariff ever could. Let me show you what's really happening. While mainstream media obsesses over Trump's latest Truth Social rants, threatening Canada with 100% tariffs, 50% aircraft levies, and his bizarre claim that he's going to decertify every plane built north of the border, they're missing the actual story. The real story isn't what Trump is threatening. It's what Mark Carney just pulled off in front of the entire world, and Trump can't do a damn thing about it. Here's what you need to understand. On January 20th, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood on a stage in Davos, Switzerland at the World Economic Forum and delivered a speech that Trump is still seething about 2 weeks later. Carney looked at an audience of global leaders and said something that should have been obvious to everyone, but apparently wasn't. Middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Trump was at the same forum. He heard those words, and within 72 hours, he had disinvited Canada from his so-called Board of Peace, threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods, and started calling Carney governor instead of prime minister. A deliberate insult suggesting Canada should be America's 51st state. But here's where it gets interesting. Carney didn't back down. He didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he called Trump's bluff to his face. When Trump claimed, "Canada lives because of the United States," Carney shot back immediately. "Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian." Then he went on television and said something that should terrify anyone paying attention to Trump's negotiating strategy. He called Trump's 100% tariff threat bluster and said he meant every word he said in Davos. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent tried to save face by telling Fox News that Carney had privately walked back his Davos remarks in a phone call with Trump. Carney held a press conference the next morning and said on camera to be absolutely clear, "And I said this to the president. I meant what I said in Davos." Trump just got called a liar by a foreign leader in public with receipts. Now, some of you are probably thinking, okay, but Canada's tiny. Trump can destroy them with tariffs. This is political theater. And that's exactly what Trump wants you to think. But let's look at the actual numbers, because this is where Trump's entire strategy collapses. The United States and Canada trade $99.1 billion worth of goods and services every single year. That's not a typo. That's $1.9 billion crossing the border every single day. Canada is the top destination for U.S. goods exports, buying $349 billion worth of American products in 2024. 34 U.S. states sell more goods to Canada than to any other foreign country. Not China, not Mexico, Canada. Canada supplies 63% of all crude oil imported into the United States. That's 1.48 billion barrels per year. If Trump actually imposed 100% tariffs on Canadian energy, gas prices in America would spike within weeks, not months, weeks. The entire U.S. automotive supply chain, which depends on Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto parts worth over $100 billion annually, would grind to a halt. So when Trump threatens 100% tariffs, he's not threatening Canada. He's threatening American consumers, American manufacturers, and American workers. And Carney knows it. That's why he's not backing down. But the tariff threats are just the surface. Let me show you what's really happening beneath all this noise. On January 16, 2026, Carney traveled to Beijing and did something that Trump explicitly warned him not to do. He made a deal with China. Under this agreement, Canada agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market annually at a reduced tariff rate of 6.1%. down from the 100% tariff Canada had imposed in 2024. In exchange, China dropped retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola, lowering rates to 15% by March 1st, 2026, and removing anti-dumping tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobster, crab, and peas. Now, here's where Trump made his first massive miscalculation. When the deal was announced, Trump initially praised it. He told reporters at the White House, "That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that." 5 days later, Trump completely reversed course and threatened 100% tariffs if Canada made a deal with China, which Canada had already done with Trump's initial approval. What changed? Carney's Davos speech. That's what changed. Trump realized that Carney wasn't just making a trade deal. He was building a coalition of middle powers to counterbalance American dominance. And Trump panicked. The China deal unlocks more than $7 billion in export markets for Canadian farmers, ranchers, and fishermen. It's a massive win for Canada's agriculture sector, which had been hammered by Chinese retaliatory tariffs imposed in response to Canada following US trade policy in 2024. But more importantly, it signals to the rest of the world that Canada is willing to decouple from US economic policy when it serves Canadian interests. And it's working. Since January, Carney has announced trade negotiations with India, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the South American trade bloc Mercosur. He's bragged to Trump about striking 12 new deals on 4 continents in 6 months. These aren't theoretical future agreements. These are active negotiations happening right now. Trump's response: more threats, more bluster, more Truth Social posts calling Carney governor and claiming China is taking over Canada. But here's the problem. Trump has already used his biggest weapon. He's already threatened 100% tariffs, and Carney called his bluff. Let me explain why Trump can't actually follow through. The United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, which Trump himself negotiated and signed during his first term, explicitly protects most Canadian goods from tariffs. As of August 2025, over 85% of Canada-US trade remains tariff-free under USMCA exemptions. Trump would have to violate his own trade agreement to impose the tariffs he's threatening. He's already done some of that. In February 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, claiming a national emergency. Canada immediately retaliated with 25% tariffs on a $30 billion worth of US imports. In March, Trump exempted USMCA-compliant goods from his tariffs because the economic damage was too severe to sustain. Trump raised tariffs again in August 2025, increasing them to 35% on non-USMCA goods. Canadian exports to the US fell 16% in April 2025. US businesses started screaming. American manufacturers that depend on Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto parts saw their costs spike. The tariffs were hurting American companies more than Canadian ones, and now Trump's threatening to do it again. Except this time, everyone knows he's bluffing, including Carney. Here's where this gets really interesting. Trump's latest threat targets Canadian aircraft, specifically planes made by Bombardier. On January 30th, 2026, Trump posted on Truth Social that he's going to decertify all Canadian aircraft until Canada certifies American-made Gulfstream jets. He threatened 50% tariffs on all Canadian aircraft sold to the US. This is where Trump reveals he has no idea what he's talking about. More than half of Bombardier's global fleet of 5,200 aircraft operates in the United States. About 2/3 of Bombardier's sales, roughly $4 billion annually, come from the US market. But here's the critical detail. Those planes are already operating in US airspace. They're already certified by the Federal Aviation Administration, which is run by a Trump appointee. Trump can't decertify planes that are already flying. It's not legally possible. Even a White House official had to clarify that Trump wasn't suggesting decertifying Canadian-built planes currently in operation. So what is he suggesting? No one knows, including Trump. Aviation lecturer John Grattick from McGill University said he was flabbergasted by Trump's threat. To decertify all Canadian-built airplanes would be a significant impact on the US air market, and Americans would probably be very upset with such a decertification issue. Translation: Trump just threatened to ground nearly 1,000 private jets used by American corporations and wealthy Americans. Good luck with that. Bombardier has about 3,000 employees in the United States. The International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers warned that Trump's threats would put thousands of jobs at risk on both sides of the border. Trump is threatening American workers to punish Canada. Let that sink in. Canadian Industry Minister Melanie Joly responded calmly, saying certification should remain apolitical and that the situation can be resolved. No panic, no desperate negotiations, just a polite reminder that aircraft certification is a safety issue, not a political weapon. Carney's strategy is brilliant because it forces Trump to choose between his ego and economic reality. Every time Trump threatens tariffs, Carney responds by diversifying Canada's trade partnerships. Every time Trump insults Canada's sovereignty, Carney doubles down on independence. And every time Trump backs down from his threats, which he always does, he looks weaker. Trump threatened to raise the tariff on Canada by 10% in October 2025 over an Ontario anti-tariff advertisement. He never followed through. He threatened to impose 100% tariffs if Canada made a deal with China. Canada made the deal. No tariffs. He threatened to decertify Canadian aircraft. Canadian planes are still flying over US airspace. There's even an acronym making the rounds among trade analysts: TACO. It stands for Trump always chickens out. And it's true. Trump's entire negotiating strategy relies on threats that he can't or won't enforce. And Carney just exposed that to the entire world. But here's why this matters to you personally beyond the geopolitical theatre. The USMCA is up for mandatory review in July 2026. That's 5 months away. Trump has already said he wants to renegotiate the entire agreement. He wants to place more restrictions on Canada's ability to sign trade deals with China. He wants to force Canada into a more subordinate economic position. Carney is making it clear that's not happening. And if Trump pushes too hard, Canada will walk away from the negotiating table with an entire portfolio of alternative trade partnerships already in place. China, India, ASEAN, Mercosur. Canada is building an economic safety net that doesn't depend on American approval. What happens if Trump actually follows through on his threats and imposes 100% tariffs? Canadian exports to the US, which totaled $411.9 billion in 2024, would collapse. Canada would enter a recession, but so would the United States. 34 US states depend on Canada as their primary export market. Gas prices would spike, auto manufacturing would shut down, supply chains for everything from steel to lumber to pharmaceuticals would break. A TD Economics report estimated that Trump's claim that the US subsidizes Canada by $200 billion annually is completely fabricated. The actual US trade deficit with Canada is approximately $45 billion, or 0.2% of US GDP. That's not a subsidy. That's a rounding error. Canada's merchandise trade surplus with the US is about $100 billion, which represents 3.2% of Canadian GDP. In other words, Canada needs US trade more than the US needs Canadian trade. But the relationship is far more balanced than Trump claims. The bulk of the US trade deficit with Canada comes from energy. Outside of energy, the scales tip in America's favor. But Trump can't impose tariffs on Canadian energy without causing immediate political damage. Gas prices are the third rail of American politics. If prices spike, Trump loses support faster than he can tweet about it. So, what's Carney's endgame? He's positioning Canada as a leader of middle powers that can act independently of both the United States and China. He's diversifying Canada's trade partnerships to reduce dependence on any single country. And he's calling Trump's bluff at every opportunity, forcing Trump to either back down or reveal that his threats are hollow. At the Davos Forum, Carney said something that every country watching this trade war should pay attention to. Great powers have exploited and weaponized economic tools like tariffs. He was talking about the United States, and he was right. Trump's tariff strategy isn't about fair trade or protecting American workers. It's about dominance. It's about forcing other countries to submit to American economic policy, regardless of their own interests. And Carney just demonstrated that it doesn't work. Not anymore. Canadian travel to the United States dropped 40% in February 2025 compared to the previous year after Trump's initial tariff threats. A March 2025 poll found that 62% of Canadians plan to avoid traveling to the US for the next year. That represents an annual loss of $4 billion for the US economy. American tourism groups are already panicking. Foreign investors reduce their exposure to Canadian securities from February to May 2025, leading to a divestment of $22.44 billion. But Canadian investors increased their exposure to foreign securities, primarily US equities and bonds, generating a net outflow of $85.9 billion from the Canadian economy in the first half of 2025. Canadian capital is fleeing to safer markets because Trump's trade policy is too unpredictable to price. Manufacturing output in Canada contracted in the second quarter of 2025 as tariffs weighed on cross-border trade. Over half of Canadian manufacturers expect rising input costs to be an obstacle in the coming months. Wage growth slowed to 0.2% in the second quarter, the slowest pace since 2016 outside the pandemic period. Canada is already feeling economic pain from Trump's trade war. But here's the critical question. Is Trump willing to inflict even more damage on the US economy to win a fight he's already losing? Because that's what 100% tariffs would do. The Congressional Research Service estimates that Canadian goods provide inputs for American businesses at a higher rate than goods from other trading partners. A disproportionate share of the negative tariff impacts on Canadian imports would flow through business supply chains and productivity, driving higher costs and inflationary pressures. Translation: Trump's tariffs make American products more expensive to produce. They raise prices for American consumers. They hurt American businesses, and they do almost nothing to help American workers. Carney knows all of this. That's why he's not afraid. That's why he keeps calling Trump's bluff. And that's why Trump keeps escalating his rhetoric without actually following through. But this can't last forever. At some point, Trump will either have to impose the tariffs he's threatening, which will devastate both economies, or back down completely, which will humiliate him on the world stage. Carney is betting Trump will choose humiliation over economic catastrophe. And so far, he's been right. Pay attention to what happens in July 2026 when the USMCA review begins. If Trump comes to the table demanding total submission, Carney will walk away. And when he does, watch how quickly other countries follow Canada's lead. India, ASEAN, Mercosur, even European nations that are tired of Trump's bullying will see that the American market isn't worth the cost of compliance anymore. Trump thinks he's using tariffs as leverage, but he's actually teaching the rest of the world how to live without America. And once that lesson is learned, it can't be unlearned. Here's what you need to watch in the coming weeks. First, look for announcements about Canada's trade negotiations with India and ASEAN. If those deals move forward quickly, it signals that Canada is serious about decoupling from US dependence. Second, watch Trump's Truth Social feed. If the threats escalate further, it means he knows he's losing control of the narrative. Third, pay attention to US business groups. If major American corporations start publicly opposing Trump's tariff threats, it means they've calculated that the economic damage is too severe to tolerate. And fourth, watch gas prices. Because if Trump actually imposes tariffs on Canadian energy, you'll see it at the pump within 2 weeks. And that will be the end of Trump's tariff strategy faster than any diplomatic negotiation could achieve. The real story here isn't about tariffs or trade deals or diplomatic insults. It's about power. Trump built his entire political brand on the idea that America is so dominant, so essential, that other countries have no choice but to submit. Carney just proved that's not true. Canada has choices, and so does every other country watching this play out. Trump's trade war with Canada is collapsing. Not because Canada is stronger than America, but because Trump's strategy was never sustainable in the first place. You can't bully your largest trading partner into submission when your economy depends on them as much as theirs depends on you, and you definitely can't do it when your threats are so transparently hollow that a foreign prime minister can call you out publicly without facing consequences. Watch what Carney does next, because whatever it is, it's going to set the template for how other countries deal with Trump for the rest of his presidency. And right now, that template looks a lot like calling his bluff, building alternative partnerships, and waiting for him to back down. Trump wanted to make America great again. Instead, he's teaching the world how to make America irrelevant. And Mark Carney is leading the class. If you want to stay ahead of what's really happening behind the headlines, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment telling me which country you think will call Trump's bluff next, because this is just getting started. The USMCA review starts in 5 months. Watch your gas prices, watch the trade headlines, and watch how many countries follow Canada's playbook. Because when Trump's tariff house of cards finally collapses, you'll want to know exactly where your money needs to